Welcome to Remembering Agnes. Thank you for attending our program this evening. My name is Richard Tritt, and I'm the photo curator here at the Society. This month is the 50th anniversary of Agnes. How many of you are old enough to actually remember it? Yeah, I remember it well. I was at graduate school at Millersville, and I couldn't get home to Bowling Springs because all the bridges were closed in the Susquehanna. And when I did get home, eventually my basement had 6 feet of water in it, and I lost my furnace. So it was a memorable day. We'll begin our program with presentations by our 4 panelists. And I'd like to introduce them briefly at this time. Shawn Gladden, just left to right, is our relatively new executive director of the Society. He was formerly the executive director of the Howard County Historical Society in Ellicott City, Maryland. There he was a witness to the deadly flash flooding in 2016 and 2018. And he's done extensive research on the flooding of that area. Agnes was the second worst flood event in the history of Ellicott City. Noel Potter is Professor Emeritus of Geology at Dickinson College. And during Agnes, he visited many local scenes and also flew over the area and took photos. And some of those he will show us tonight. He's the person responsible for this program because about 6 months ago, he reminded us that the anniversary was coming up soon. Randy Watts is a local historian and author, and during Agnes, he was a young volunteer, very young, I think, for the Cumberland Fire Company. And he responded to calls throughout the area. Randy has written numerous books and about various aspects of the history of Cumberland County, including histories of all the fire companies. And our 4th guest is Rob Clem, who's a retired fire chief of the Camp Hill Fire Company number 1. And he started his service Fire Company in 1959, and he's currently serving as the fire police lieutenant. During Agnes, he was the highest ranked fire company officer at Camp Hill. So now I'll turn the program over to our first speaker, Shawn.
Thank you. I believe I may be one of the few people who was not alive in this room during Agnes, but that's okay. That's why we have photo archives. My part of the presentation is kind of supplemental to what you'll be hearing this evening. As Richard had said, I grew up in Howard County and grew up in Ellicott City and was very familiar with the flooding, but I was an eyewitness. I was there running a museum in Ellicott City when we got hit with those last 2 pretty significant flash floods. My presentation and what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of take a more regional look at Agnes. I'm going to show you what happened in Ellicott City. Now, how many folks in the room are familiar with Ellicott City, have visited Ellicott City? Okay. So when I tell you it is a giant stone funnel, you know what I'm talking about, right? I'll explain that in a second. First of all, let's go ahead and talk about what Agnes was. Hurricane Agnes in 1972 was the costliest hurricane to hit the United States at the time, causing an estimated $2.1 billion in damage. The hurricane's death toll nationally was 128. The effects of Agnes were widespread, from the Caribbean to Canada, with much of the east coast of the United States affected. Damage was heaviest in Pennsylvania, where Agnes was the state's wettest tropical cyclone. Due to the significant effects, the name Agnes was retired in the spring of 1973, never to be named a hurricane named Agnes again. Now, I'm going to focus on Maryland and more specifically the Patapsco River Valley. In the state of Maryland, damage totaled to 110 million and 19 fatalities were reported. The hardest hit area was the Patapsco River Valley, with widespread destruction of buildings, roads, and railroads in the state park. At Daniels, which was one of the longest standing mills in Ellicott City, and I'll show that on the map shortly. The flooding was first reported in the morning hours of June 22nd, and water was reported to be as high as 40 feet above normal. River Road, which was along the Patapsco, was almost completely washed out. More than 900 people were evacuated from their homes in Howard County. National Guard helicopters were used to rescue workmen from the roof of the Daniels plant. And in Elkridge, a family of 6 was forced from their home and they attempted to reach high ground in a small boat. It capsized and all 6 held onto the boat for several hours until it reached more shallow water. So these are some of the stories that obviously not only that we had in Howard County, some of the stories you're going to hear from our panelists this evening. So before I get started, I kind of want to set up a little bit about Agnes and kind of give you, obviously the folks in this room probably are familiar with what happened here in Carlisle, Cumberland County, we'll hear that this evening. But we figured as a part of this presentation and to give me a reason for standing up here and talking to you, I'm going to give you the Ellicott City version. So if you aren't familiar with Ellicott City, this is the Patapsco River Valley from 1859. And the reason I bring this up is because it really shows you why we had and continue to have flooding problems in Ellicott City. This river is the Patapsco River. Okay? This is Main Street, Ellicott City. Okay? Now, what we don't see in this is there are 3 tributaries that run along here, here, and here that all converge right here underneath all of these buildings. So when at some point Ellicott City, in its transition from mill town to city, decided that they would build buildings on top of the old mill races. So when you see the flash flooding on television, and the ones that we had in 2016, 2018, that's basically what we call top-down flooding. And we've had, in our history of Ellicott City, we've had 30 significant floods in Ellicott City's history. 7 of them have been top-down, which resulted from flash flooding, which means that we get the flash flooding event and the water pushes right through Main Street and goes into the Patapsco. We've had 7 of those. The other 23 were Patapsco rising, okay, and backfilling into the town. Agnes was a bottom-up flood. The floods of the Patapsco River Valley. These are all of the floods that we identified while I was executive director of the Howard County Historical Society. 30 floods in 232 years, and if you see in 1889 and 1952, we had 2 floods in the same year. 1889 seems to be the year of the flood. Does anybody want to tell me what other flood? 1889, that's correct. So, needless to say, in Ellicott City, we have a flooding problem. Okay. The flood of 1972 was a result of Hurricane Agnes, which at the time, as I said, was the costliest hurricane in U.S. history. 704 people were left homeless, 103 homes and 50 businesses suffered significant damage, including the historic home of Jonathan Ellicott. Now, Jonathan Ellicott's house and George Ellicott's house are right next to each other. I'll show you by the end of my presentation what happened to the George Ellicott house. But also, take a look at that marker, 1972, 14 and a half feet. That is the measurement of how high the wall of water was on Main Street in 1972. In Ellicott City, we used to have a post by the B&O Railroad Museum that marked every one of the flood heights in our history. And Agnes was second from the top at 14 and a half feet. Now, if you go to Ellicott City today, that post is not there anymore. It was washed out in the last flood. very able, and actually, this is one of the interesting things about being executive director of the Historical Society, is after the flood, people were going into the Patapsco River and fishing out things, and if they weren't of any value, and they wanted a quick tax write-off, they brought them up to us. So I had all of those markers in our collection. So, now, as I said, remember the 1972 one, because the worst flood in our history was in 1868, where the water was 21 and a half feet high. And this is an image from Harper's Weekly in 1868. I will say this seems a little overdramatic, but it's certainly, I mean, from the eyewitness accounts that day, it did seem like total devastation. We lost 46 people died in the 1868 flood. We did lose 14 lives in the Agnes Flood. Okay. And these are just a few images from Agnes. I figured as we were doing this presentation this evening, you're going to see a lot of images from our collection, from Professor Potter's collection, and obviously, you know, these flood images all are very similar. It's high standing water. But once again, remember Ellicott City's specific problem, okay? Ellicott City is a big mountain of granite. And we are also at the lowest point of not only Howard County, but also Baltimore County, which is our adjacent county. So literally everything flows right into that funnel and right down into the Patapsco. So, like I said, when we had flash flooding, blows through the town in a half hour, an hour, and then it's all gone and leaving its wreckage in its path. What we saw with Agnes is the standing water. This is actually at the bottom of Ellicott City, right by the B&O Bridge and right by the river. And the water took, I believe, a full day to recede. Okay. And then when it did recede, this picture over here, the black and white picture, is what the town looked like afterwards. Some more images of Lower Main Street. And this is what the Patapsco River looked like. Those buildings that you see over here, that's the Jonathan Ellicott and George Ellicott houses, which at the time were the oldest structures in Ellicott City and had been there since 1772. Jonathan Ellicott House was completely wiped out, and I'll show you the fate of the George Ellicott House momentarily. Once again, another image of Agnes in Ellicott City. This is the C.R. Daniels Mill. This mill structure, this site is one of the original Ellicott Mill sites going back to the colonial period when the Ellicott brothers arrived in the Patapsco River Valley and began their milling operation. This, at one point, was the Ellicott Upper Mills. It was bought out by a company named C.R. Daniels in the 1800s, and it had been in existence all the way up to 1972. My understanding is it was no longer a mill as of 1972, and it was actually a sporting goods manufacturer in 1972 when it had been wiped out. But this entire complex was completely wiped out. And this was a mill town, so it was, not only did you have the Daniels factory, you had Daniels town. Both were completely wiped out. To this day, they have reestablished Daniels on higher ground, but this area today is still not, there really isn't anything being used for this area because it's still a very susceptible floodplain. So I was mentioning what happened to the George Ellicott building. Now, as I wrap up my comments, and if I can just kind of give you a little bit of a flash forward of what you're going to be seeing this evening. I give the intro, kind of a little background of Agnes. Professor Potter's going to come up and give his presentation, and then we're going to have the EMS response with our final two presenters, and Randy and Bob. I'm going to kind of end my short presentation by saying there's a silver lining to some extent after Agnes for Ellicott City. Howard County and Ellicott City had a very poor record with historical preservation prior to the 1972 Agnes flood. What 1972 prompted, and then we were hit by Eloise 3 years later. So 72 and 75 really hit Ellicott City significantly. What this prompted is the creation of what was called Historic Ellicott City, which was really the area's first preservation organization. And by 1977, all of Ellicott City had been designated on the National Historic Register as a historically protected property. So there was a silver lining that came out of Agnes for us. And the fact that we were able to create a historic district in Ellicott City allowed us to save many of the old buildings that, if you have obviously been to Ellicott City, you're familiar with. Unfortunately, we keep building over those mill races. So now they just underwent a huge project where they're building, they actually got funding for a tunnel that they're going to build underneath Ellicott City that should divert the flash flood waters when they come through. But, you know, we don't know. They've tried different things in the past. Many folks in Ellicott City think that the answer would be to do what Harper's Ferry did. Just give up on the low ground, move everything to high ground. But as of right now, the status quo in Ellicott City is rebuild and hope it doesn't happen again. But what I want to show you right now is like I said, this is kind of this I guess would be a success story. And this has to do with the George Ellicott House. I'm showing this video to show what happened with the George Ellicott House, but also to give you some video of the flooding that day. That's the George Ellicott House today. Yes. And that gentleman is recently passed away. That's Charles Wagan, who was probably the lead preservationist coming out of 1972. When he was with us, he was a very humble man and kind of downplayed his role. No, he was responsible for this. So that's how I'll end my presentation. It is my honor to welcome up Professor Potter. And I will get his presentation up and set. Thank you. Okay.
Give it a second.
Broke it, Doctor.
Okay. Mr. Potter, it's all yours. Please watch this cord right here.
Shawn, you haven't told us where the Howard County Historical Society was with respect to the floods.
Oh, yes, we were lucky. We're up on the hill. So I will say this, in 2016, 2018, I stood outside of our museum looking down into the valley and witnessed it all. And it was quite an experience. So, Professor Potter, all yours.
Thank you. You have, some of you have seen a few of these pictures in the Sentinel in the last few days. They've come up online. This particular one, I think the label was half mile off. It said that this was North Middlesex Road, but actually let's see if this will work. There's a bridge, Iron Bridge. Connequina Creek flows through here. This is Wolf's Bridge Road. And this is Crimson Drive in front of the houses, cut on the water. Oh, use this thing. I came around the corner because I wanted to use my pointer. So to say it again, the road going this way is Wolf's Bridge Road. Come back this way and you get to Route 11 in a little while by the sheets. And this is Clemson Drive underneath in front of the houses. So we'll... Can I just push the up command?
You just click like that.
Okay.
It's,
Oh, how do I back up?
oh, there you go.
There.
We'll use these arrows right down.
Okay, set the scene a little bit. I just happened to have taken this picture 3 days before Agnes. It was on the weekend. I was taking care of a friend's cabin down at Pine Grove. I was taking care of a cabin down at Pine Grove Furnace for a friend. I came back 3 days before Agnes, and it had rained hard, and this is the playground behind Letart School. So it's already wet. There's no room for water to soak into the ground. So set the scene a little bit. This is a very old map made just after the flood. You can go and find modern ones, all gussied up now, but it gives the general idea. The storm started down off the Yucatan Peninsula, came up across the Gulf of Mexico, in western Florida, and it became a hurricane down in our southeastern states. But by the time it got up here, there were no more winds, and by that time it's called a tropical storm rather than a hurricane. You need the winds to make a hurricane. But note that it went out to sea a little bit, and I always had the feeling it went out to get some more water. And then it swung in over northern Pennsylvania and just sat here, and don't. And the map on the left, another old one, I just picked out the area that got more than 10 inches of rain during Agnes. And it doesn't take anybody that knows the area very well to realize that this is exactly, or almost exactly, over the Susquehanna Basin. There was a good bit of flooding beyond. A couple of pictures to give a sense of what was happening early. This is on East South Street, looking down toward Letort Park. And this is on the little footbridge at the end of the street, looking along Letort Creek. And it's usually between a couple of walls here, but you can barely see the walls. And little note down at the bottom, Harrisburg got over 12 inches of rain in 24 hours. And so think about this much rain on every square foot of land. Where is it going to go? And it went. So, familiar place, Southwest Street, Elwood Gardens on the right. Just to the left up here is where Walnut Bottom Road starts. The corner at the time was an old house. It was flooded all around it. It's where Tom Colstock and then more recently Dr. Appleby have had their dentist offices. And if you ever go to those dentist offices, behind the people at the reception desk are a couple of photographs. This one, I think, is one of them. And water accumulated in a number of places far from creeks. You would think that most of the flooding would be along the creek. But it happens that in limestone, where little sinkholes form and depressions form, water accumulated in a number of other places. This is just off of Walnut Bottom Road, not far from Belvedere Street. So to give some perspective, floods in this area, this is the U.S. Geological Survey gauging station on City Island in Harrisburg, and they have marked the various floods down here, and I've outlined Agnes is the biggest one of record, with a bit over 1 million cubic feet a second going down the stream. Yeah, and for comparison, it's really an interesting one. The Mississippi River we usually think of as our biggest stream in the country, draining the whole middle part of the country, from near Pittsburgh to the Rocky Mountains, the northern Rockies at least. And the average flow of the Mississippi in New Orleans is only 600,000 cubic feet per second. So we had more going by a good bit, than the average flow of the Mississippi for a short time. Other major floods, 1936 was a flood due to ice just downstream, and it flooded the Harrisburg area. Storm Lee, 1996 is the one that everybody remembers because it was a rain on snow event, and it's the one that the ice took out 3 sections of the Walnut Street Bridge. The Walnut Street Bridge survived Agnes. And note also, 1972 Agnes, so-called roughly 200-year flood, 150-year flood, something like that. 3 years later, this one down here. It's statistics. You know, you can flip a coin and there's no reason you can't get 3 heads in a row, or maybe even 5, a little less probability then. So, oh darn it. Where's the backup? So I started traveling around as it rained. I teach geology. I taught intro geology up at Dickinson, and I wanted some pictures of mud washing off of fields. Remember, this was before no-till farming, and so lots more mud went off fields in those days. And I saw lots of scenes like this one. This is looking south in Mount Holly Gap, just south of the Holly Inn. And at the height of the flood, one could not go through the gap. And in fact, that picture that we got at the beginning of our program of Deer Lodge was taken just down the way by me going across the creek, down the railroad and looking across the creek at Deer Lodge. So I started traveling around. I didn't realize it was going to be the biggest flood of record. And so I just started taking pictures. And this is the sort of thing I saw. This is North Middlesex Road. Go out to the truck stops on Route 11 beyond the turnpike and turn left at, I think, the first stoplight. And this is just down the way. Just over my right shoulder is where Latort Creek joins the Connettaquinnet. And what I saw, I went back later and got the picture of before, it's actually after, and the water was rising. And somebody could still go across, but this rapidly changed. I kept going out. Come on. Yeah, and now you can't go across the bridge. Oh gosh. And notice this sign. There's the same sign. That's my old Ford. And there's a lovely little Mennonite chapel on the left side here. Ah, it worked. And so eventually the water was so high that I said, oh gosh, geologists love an aerial view of things. And I went and saw my friend Ken Laws, who taught physics at Dickinson and had an airplane, and we went out to the airport and had to push the airplane out of a puddle and went flying. And North Middlesex Road is in this picture. There it is. And the little Mennonite chapel is right there. There's the bridge. Latort Creek comes in here. And incidentally, for those who know the area, the new Carlisle sewage plant is right in here. In those days, Carlisle sewage plant was just off of Post Road, just beyond the War College. Down at the bottom, all the truck stops. Oh, and then it goes through. Sorry, you might as well stay here. Thank you. Okay, big problem. This is the Pennsylvania Turnpike. It was flooded. It was flooded. It happens that this is Meadowbrook Road. Does anybody know where Meadowbrook Road is? A few of you do. If you want to get there, go out Newville Road and it's just beyond the last warehouse. At least warehouse as of this week. Who knows what's there in a few weeks? And the distinctive thing is, this is the route of Alexander Spring Run. And those who know Alexander Spring Run, ordinarily it's like this. And in fact, what's happening with most of this water is the water has risen in Conadiquinnet Creek and it's flooded back. Okay? So we'll just do a tour north of Carlisle. Here's Wagoner's Gap Road. We're looking toward Carlisle. Carlisle is up here. Water going over the bridge. Next. Carlisle's water treatment plant. Long's Gap Road. And in those days, there were lots of summer school students at Dickinson. And lots of them went out there, and that's a large number of the people here are students helping sandbag to try to save the water treatment plant. And I gather that it was saved. I don't remember water being turned off in town. Next. And Route 34, Starrett Gap Road, yikes. This is all developed now, and it's developed on this side, Schlosser Village. Next. And here we're looking toward Carlisle, Route 11, new section of Interstate 81, the Turnpike, and Latort Creek. And notice all the traffic on the Turnpike going one way. It's blocked, and they're making everybody get off at Carlisle. Next. And in Harrisburg, we went over the Susquehanna River in Harrisburg. This is Interstate 81 under construction, the Interstate 81 bridge. And this is looking toward Harrisburg, east. So if you drove over 81 and wanted to go down Front Street, you'd have gone down this ramp. We're not quite done yet. Next. And a little further downriver, here's the Zembo-Bosk Polyclinic Hospital. I don't know the rest of these, but there's a wonderful story. Wonderful unless you were the victims. When we had the 25th anniversary, somebody asked me to do a talk, show slides in Harrisburg. And among the people who came was Harold Swinson, who was the mayor of Harrisburg before that guy that was going to be mayor for life. And Swinson had this wonderful story about somebody in an area like this that knew the water was rising. They went out and rented a truck like a U-Haul or whatever, one of those trucks, backed it up to the porch, got friends to help load all their furniture from the downstairs into it, and they're all ready to go. And he and whoever it was went out, and they're all excited as the water's rising around the tires, and he gets into the truck, and he broke the key. And the truck ended up sitting there and getting flooded. Oh dear, next. Further down the river, that's the governor's mansion, oh gosh. And Milton Sharp, the older of you will remember, moved out, and he moved over to Camp Hill, and in fact, he never went back. He stayed there for the rest of his administration. And notice some smoke here. Next. Focusing on the smoke. The firemen over there probably know more about this than I do, but some buildings caught fire. Just, I think it's about 2nd Street. And fire trucks way back there. This is not a very convenient way to haul hoses and get them. Notice they are spraying water. And I understand that they got some kind of like a National Guard truck or something to haul the hoses in. But this is not an easy way to deal with fires. Go ahead. And we've now gone downriver a little more. This is part of Shipoke. This is the South Bridge. And if you were going to Harrisburg and going to get off on 2nd Street, you get off here and go down underneath and, oops. You get water. The South Bridge was open. And for scale, notice all these white dots? Those are Pincy Supply cement mixer trucks. Next. Steelton.
That's Camp Hill.
Pardon?
That looks like Purina in Camp Hill.
No, this is Steelton.
Oh, Steelton.
Looking downriver next. And Harrisburg International Airport. There's the runway. And in those days, there was a very small terminal. That's the terminal. Most of the facilities were left over from the old Air Force base. Next. New Cumberland. Most of you will know the big iron bridge in New Cumberland. And this is the Old Bridges Creek and Capital City Airport. Next. Williams Grove. There's a trailer park there. And I won't bother you now doing it, but I've counted, and there's approximately 50 trailers in there. These are Ashcomb's greenhouses. Okay. We're almost there.
Next. Boiling Springs Lake, Yellow Bridges Creek. And the interesting thing is, notice that there's brown water going into the lower end of the lake. So the water level rose sufficient to send a pulse back into the lower end of the lake, near that building that had a fire a month or two ago. Next. Looking from the Yellow Bridges south, and this is PPG, now Vitro, the glass plant being built. And notice all these puddles. Those puddles are maybe an acre or 2 or 3. And these are the kinds of things that form in the limestone from the rock dissolving underneath. They fill up with water, and if some developer runs the road through and builds your house in the wrong place, you may be in trouble. Next. We're back to Harrisburg. We're looking almost straight down at what the locals call the bottleneck, where you come from the east shore to the west shore. This is the Market Street Bridge with water going over it. And this is the Walnut Street Bridge. And I came over here, and I obviously couldn't go there, but I parked somewhere and got up on this railroad and went right there and took some pictures out that way. Next. And so there's the Market Street Bridge. Imagine leaving the baseball game and coming to the West Shore. That's where you would arrive. And here's the Walnut Street Bridge with its trestle still intact. And now here's afterward, I went back, and it's right here where Dockside Willie's is now. Next. And you will hear from the firemen about the agonies of trying to get water out of people's basement and other places. And one has to be careful. They may tell you about it. If you
pump the water down on the inside, and there is high water in the ground on the outside, the pressure is there, and it may collapse a wall. This happens to be just a stairwell at Elwood Gardens, but it could be a whole basement wall. I better stop, right?
I don't want you to stop, but we... Okay. Thank you. There were 30 more slides on that presentation. You gotta come back to part 2.
Can we have the photos up, please?
I think we can certainly do that. Absolutely. Okay. And there you go, Bob Clem. And Randy Watson. Okay, Bob and I are going to tell the story from the fire department perspective. And just a quick overview, there were no fatalities in Cumberland County during the Agnes Flood that I'm aware of. We had no major fires, no major accidents. Nobody could go fast enough to crash into themselves. So there's no spectacular story. The flooding was not as dramatic as you just saw the pictures out of Yellowstone, where things were washed away. It came up, and it came up generally, for the most part, gradually, but there was some wash loads and some damage, but it tended to be a little bit more gradual. So there's no real dramatic stories, but we do want to tell you about our perspective of what we saw from the inside. Now, Bob was the ranking fire officer at Camp Hill Fire Company, which becomes the EOC for the West Shore. There was no coordinated county response at this point. Each community did its own thing, but they did realize through Commissioner Raymond Sawyer that they needed to react on the West Shore, and that's the story that we'll largely tell tonight.
Give us some thought now. You've seen what's happened up in the center part of the county, Carlisle area, and think about the creeks. You have the Old Bridges, you have the Winter Creek, and all that water has to go somewhere, goes into the creeks, and where does it head? It heads to the West Shore. Well, you saw how that storm went up and hooked back around. Now you have all that water coming down the Susquehanna River, and now you have these two creeks coming in there. Water can't go into the Susquehanna, it keeps backing up, and then all the problems started in the center part of the county. And then all the water started to move into the West Shore area, and that's what we're going to look at here. I guess we won't be able to use the remote. Okay.
I gotta go up there again.
Okay, now try.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, we're fortunate that after the flood, Commissioner Sawyer wrote an after-action report, and he did it in conjunction with John Snyder, who's the civil defense director. We'll talk a little bit about them. We were able to obtain a copy of that, and we donated it to the society many years ago, and that's the root document for a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight to explain the EOC and what the impacts were on the West Shore.
So let's start. Basically, it was raining all day. I finally got to bed that night, and right after I got to bed, about 11:30, my pager you see down there at the bottom, my radio, it activated, and they said, any company 14 chief call headquarters. So I picked up the phone, I called, and I told who I was. He says, Chief 214 got that, and he hung up on me. I thought, boy, that's rude. Well, I started listening to the radio, and I understood what was going on, because the Carlisle area, they've been busy out there with all the water problems. Now it's moving onto the West Shore itself. And during that evening, we had 4 to 5 inches of rain down there. And so now all of a sudden we got all these flooded basements. At one time when one of our people did a count, we had over 350 requests for basements to be pumped.
Now, something to keep in mind, when this flood happened, there was no 911 system. That doesn't come until 1977. And the courthouse, the basement of the courthouse housed the fire alarm and the police communication system for Cumberland County. At that point on the 3 to 11 shift, they worked with 3 dispatchers. Now there's probably 12. And you talk to the dispatchers, everybody in the county whose basement flooded called for help. Nobody stopped start to think that maybe I'm not alone, maybe nobody can do anything. So the dispatchers would pick up the phone, my basement's flooded, it's on fire. No, boom, hang up. Guys would work 16-hour shifts, they'd go home and try and sleep, and they'd be in their sleep, and you talk to them, and it went on for days like that. So when Bob talks about can't tell them 350 calls, at that point we had 37 fire companies, multiply 350 times 37, it gives you some idea of what the dispatchers were going through.
And Randy and I both have been part-time dispatchers, so we have an idea what they were going through. Early in 1971, when I was at the West Shore Fire Chiefs meeting, I brought up the idea about approaching the county to put on a second radio frequency because the number of calls in the county was slowly increasing in numbers, automatic alarms and everything else. Well, I was told by the president at that time, he says they don't need one, so I got a hold of my fire company, and by the end of 1971, we had all our radios converted, so we had 2 frequencies now. We didn't have to stay on the main fire channel with all the 37 other fire companies that were in the county. And so you can see the base up there. What we did is we put this person there, and he started taking information over the telephone from the county, people calling directly into the firehouse. And what he was doing is he was having the different crews going out and doing checking. And now we've increased it, we now added a car table, and had 3 people over there to handle it. These people are waiting to be assigned where to go. And finally we decided with all these calls coming in, 2 portable pumps, over 350 basements, right? So we sat down and we basically decided, what are we going to do? We decided we weren't going to pump basements. Well, earlier I had a chance to get down to my in-laws. They were stuck up on the northern part of the state, up around the New York border. They were camping, and they couldn't come home because Interstate 81 was shut down. You saw pictures of a little while ago over there on some of those, there at the Harrisburg on the South Bridge. Well, that's the way Interstate 81 was at a lot of different places. And so, all well and good, when I went down to the house to check it, water's coming up through the floor drain. Water's coming through the cinder block. And so we had this meeting, I'm thinking about this water coming through the cinder block, the water table's real high, so I was concerned about if we go out and start pumping basements, with the water being that high, water table, are we going to start collapsing walls and having floors come up? And so we decided we were not going to even attempt with 2 portable pumps to pump all those basements at that time. So all well and good. A couple of days later, I went by and the person was running a portable pump, and I stopped and asked him, how's it going? He said, I got almost all the water out. I said, any problems? He said, well, he says, 4 of my basements heaved up, I'm going to have to get it replaced. And boy, right away, I thought, okay, we made a good decision. Well, that was Wednesday night, Thursday morning, Thursday afternoon. Thursday evening, early in the evening, I got a phone call from Cumberland County EOC, and they wanted to know about moving or establishing an emergency operations center at our fire station on the West Shore. I think it's one of the newer stations on the West Shore. Plus, we had a base station in our fire station. It was on the main fire frequency plus our own fire frequency. And so at that point in time, I said, well, sure, that's not a problem, but we only have 1 telephone into our firehouse. And he said, well, we're going to need 4. I said, okay, if you want, I'll give Bell Telephone a call and see if I can get things started. I pulled out my little trusty notebook, and in there, you see down the bottom, we had a fire alarm box in front of the firehouse that went a block away to operate the siren. If somebody pulled that hook on there, the siren would go. Well, we discontinued that, but I happened to have the circuit number of that one, plus another one that was not in use. And so when I talked to Bell Telephone Repair, and he says, we can't get any phones there until tomorrow sometime. I said, well, I got 2 circuit numbers. So I gave him the 2 circuit numbers. He says, they're good. Shortly thereafter, they had a person from Bell show up, and they had 2 telephones there. So when the commissioner and the CD director showed up the next morning, we had 2 out of the 4 phones set up, and the next day, Bell came in, and a block away, they ran telephone lines down for the other 2 phones. And these are the communities that were served on the West Shore by that EOC. And it was interesting in the Sentinel, Ted Wise, who was a former public safety director, commented at that point in time there was no EOC. And so this probably was the first EOC that in the county was established. And then eventually they did put one in the basement of the new courthouse. And this is right here, if you look on the right, hit the right button here. Now this is Commissioner Sawyer at this point in time, he's here. You now have a bigger table, and there's bases back there. This is me right here in my younger days.
This is before
Look at Commissioner Sawyer again, he's on the phone. At this point in time, ready to get there. And we move on. And this person right here, Sally Ernst, she becomes very, very important to the county when it's all said and done. And look here, it says, this is part of Commissioner Sawyer's report. Sally Ernst of Camp Hill, a freshman from Lock Haven College, for working many hours at the EOC, answering the telephone, assisting with the organization of the EOC, and helping build our resource telephone. She maintained all sorts of records. And when Commissioner Sawyer left that day, he took a big stack of papers with him to the county, and then when they filed for the federal government for the disaster relief funds, he had all this documentation right there that made it easy. And what they ended up doing, since she was an unemployed student at this point because she was a lifeguard at the pool was shut down, they wrote her a check and gave her a check for her services, which we thought was outstanding that they did that. And there's John Snyder. He was the CD director at that time. And if we look at the comment that Commissioner Sawyer had, he should be recognized for his contribution to the overall operation of the EOC. He was constantly working with almost overwhelming problems, and at no time did he lose control of the situation. His previous interest in training in CD activities paid off. His words were clear and concise. He is known for what he was doing. So yes, and it was interesting. He had all sorts of people calling and having problems that they wanted to solve, and we'll address a couple of those problems as we go through here.
And there's a backstory with John. John was sick at that point with lymphoma, and he dies in 1976, and he was a first-class gentleman. The other thing that's interesting is his daughter, Tanya Snyder, now Tanya Hoover, went on to become the state fire marshal for the state of California, and later became the head of the National Fire Administration. So that was John's legacy that carried on for the next 50 years. So John was already, he knew he was terminally ill at that point, and he was there for days on end. I don't know that he slept. I mean, he went all out.
They decided, since it's an EOC, we should have police communications, so they made a phone call. They called Mark Bin Communications, and he sent Carl Rex, the technician, up there with the base station that you can see there, and a spool of antenna cable. And what they did is they ran an antenna out of the window, and the next thing they hoisted it up the flagpole. Now we had coverage of the west shore of the police base. And yes, it did work. And one of the things I do remember, we had a crew at a house, and they had calmed the mother and her children down. They had water coming in the back of the house into the basement window, and it was flowing out the front of the house. And you saw some of the pictures there before. Well, this is one of the problems that they had. Well, they got him calmed down, but then the husband, father showed up, and he got a little bit unruly. He thought the fire company should do something. What are you going to do with all this water pouring into the back of the house and going out the front? And so they called back on a frequency, and they called the police on there, and the police showed up, and they calmed him down because he didn't want to make a trip to Carlisle. Now, some of the things you had to address, people had to eat. And here's the EOC, and of course the National Guard was called out. And here the National Guard has showed up, and the Presbyterian Church next door, they basically were feeding people, the EOC, the National Guard, and the commissioner put this in there. The members of Camp Hill Church, located next door to the EOC, who provided constant support in feeding guards, personnel, the EOC, evacuees and others for their help in establishing a clothing collection center. And you can see the guards there, they come over there, and Randy, basically, we went over to the church end, their all-purpose room that had a kitchen, and we had salvage masters getting up the water and squeegees, and then Randy took advantage of that place.
Well, by Sunday afternoon of the flood, there was a chlorine tank, and Bob has started this in a minute, but a chlorine tank broke loose at the water plant in New Cumberland. And they were very concerned that there was going to be a mass casualty incident. So I was at the Cumberland Fire Company in Carlisle. They dispatched 2 of our ambulances to run emergency from Carlisle to Camp Hill to stand by for this possible gas leak. So we hopped in our ambulances. Now keep in mind, I'm not quite 18 and I'm driving an ambulance under emergency conditions to Camp Hill, which I wasn't really even sure where it was. And we get down to the firehouse and we report in, and they said, well, right now we're okay, but there's food at the church if you want any. So we go over, we eat a wonderful turkey dinner, best meal we'd had in a week, come back to the firehouse, said, you can go home. This is the inside of the rear of the firehouse, the water coming underneath the doors. Here's the rear of it. There are 3 storm drains right there. At this point in time, the storm system could not handle the water runoff, and so you can see the water's backed up 6 inches there at that point in time. A little bit more than running into the living side of the, instead of just the apparatus floor. And you can see the rain is coming down there. That was taken Wednesday night. Okay, now, we had a place called College Park. There's about 100 houses down there. And in the background, that was Route 767. Anybody know what Route 767 is? Or used to be? How about the Harrisburg Expressway or Route 581? Okay, that's what that is up there. There's a 10-foot pipe that was underneath there. About a third of the borough drains down to that area to go underneath that 10-foot pipe. Look what's happened right there. It's back up. Look at the car over there. You can see here how far the water's come up. This is how people were checking on their houses down there. They had a rowboat, and they would row over to their house, check it out, and row back to a common, or they had somebody else get in the boat, and they'd row over and check their house. And there's another one. There's the intersection. And now we had some problems. And of course, River and Water had we knew they had a water main break. Reading some of the back newspapers from 72, they had several water main breaks, and apparently they were underwater, so they didn't know where they were. But they're watching their gauges, and they're seeing the gauges drop, and water and all their water tanks are going down. The one behind my house is 1.2 million gallons of water. Well, they said, according to the paper, they lost over 10 million gallons of water out of all of those standpipes. And the Fairview Township plant on the Yellow Breeches, it was inundated. And what Randy was just talking about that chlorine leak, that's where it was on the Yellow Breeches. And Bill Ruda came into the firehouse. He was an employee at the river. He came in and he said, we got a problem. And he already told me about the problem. So we loaded up a crew on our rescue truck, and on the directions of Bill, they went down there, and then they waded in through the water with Bill. They got in there. He was able to turn off the chlorine leak itself, and then the guys secured that tank that was floating around, so it didn't create any additional problem. And that's when they told Randy he could go home. But think about it, when you have a water plant that's inundated, you have all those water standpipes, 10 million gallons of water, doing one of these, 13 inches of rainwater, 10 million more gallons of water added to it. And well, we lost domestic water, we lost water for fire protection, and the Silver Spring plant was still in operation at that time, and so it was able to fill tankers. And they finally got some limited water back, but they said anybody caught using their garden hose to clean up, they would have them arrested. And that was common throughout the county. Carlisle did lose their water plant. They lost the electric, and it was shut down for 2 or 3 days. Carlisle had no water main breaks. Fortunately, they had added a new tank up by the intermediate school, and there was enough water in the storage system, and through conservation, that Carlisle got through till the water system came back on. But it was touch and go. In Carlisle, Mechanicsburg had similar problems, and it's something you take for granted, the drinking water. It's not guaranteed in a situation like this.
It took River Water Company, after they got the water mains corrected, took them a week until they got water, step back in the standpipe to get decent pressure back into the system. So, from the fire protection standpoint, what the CD director did is he called for tanker 50 from Penn Township to transfer down to Camp Hills Fire Station to be available on the West Shore. Well, they showed up, and then so we said, hey, you guys just got here, we're eating lunch, let's go have lunch. And so that was a mistake. We went in, they knew somebody got their lunch, and we got a call, smoke in the structure. Well, we responded to it, and we were fortunate. It was damp, people put a fire in their fireplace, and they forgot to open the chimney damper. So we got the smoke out of the house, we went back, and we said, okay, now, before we go eat, you tell us how we're going to work with this tanker. Since we didn't work with tankers, you tell us how we're going to work with tankers down here, which they did. And then what we did is we set 2 portable pumps up over at the borough pool, which was shut down because there was no water. We had a 3-inch hose out, so if we had to, we could fill that tanker or an engine from the borough swimming pool. Now, we had a drinking water problem, no drinking. So basically, we were lucky. This Ray Troutman from Freight Lines down in North Carolina, he could not go up 81 because it was shut down. So he pulled in there in the church parking lot and said, hey, I got a tractor trailer if I can be of any help to you. Great. Well, I remember going out Mount Rock Road, there was a stainless steel milk tanker up there, and so the CD director called the county and they tracked it down, and he said, yes, you can use it. He gave directions, he went up there with his tractor, hooked up, drug that tanker down, got it flushed down at Silver Spring water plant, filled it up, put it in the Presbyterian Church, and then we now have that. Plus, they also got the tin tankers from Letterkenny to space them throughout the West Shore for people to get drinking water. And of course, now you got to remember now, if you look there, they also had 250-gallon tanks that they put at the different shelters. And don't forget, we had Holy Spirit Hospital, and we had a number of nursing homes on the West Shore. So they had to also get drinking water for those people. And basically, the councilman from Camp Hill, he volunteered, he coordinated and maintained constant supervision of the water supply point serviced by the EOC during the entire operation. People coming forward and volunteering, which was great. Keep that in mind for later on. This is up in Charlestown. These people are coming in to fill the containers with water. Okay, what about sand? Flush the toilet. We had the EOC, we had the National Guard coming in there, we had the EOC people in there, people from the church, and so what we did, after the rain stopped, we opened that grate back to the firehouse, and there's natural springs underneath the cemetery that constantly always have water flowing through there. So we put a submersible pump down in there, and it goes over, and if you look here, this tank right here, it's an old fuel tank, 270-gallon fuel tank. We cut the side out of it, and back then, fire companies used to use pumping contests. And so what we did is repurposed it, plumbed it in there, and you see there's a bucket over here. When you did your business, you took the bucket that was next to it and you flushed the toilet. You walked out, filled the bucket, took it back in and put it there for the next person.
This is in the age, we didn't have porta pots back then. Okay, this is before porta pots were invented.
These are where the different shelter locations were located on the West Shore.
One of the things that's interesting, and we'll touch on this a couple times, nobody had planned for this. Civil defense at the time was set up for nuclear bomb attack and recovery from nuclear attack. We never planned for a 100-year flood because we never had a 100-year flood. And so now we have this problem and everything's done on the fly. As Bob will say, this guy comes back with his Mr. Troutman again, and you can explain his daring journey across the Taylor Bridge.
Yep. You saw some of the pictures, what the bridges look like with the water going underneath in the Susquehanna. Well, they called the state police and got permission for him to take his tractor trailer across the Harvey Taylor Bridge and go to Fort Indian Town Camp and pick up 1,000 pots. And then he distributed the shelters on his way back. There's the bridge right there that he had to go across. But they had a police escort all the way to Uniontown Gap in order to get cops to the various shelters. And here's a picture of one of the newspapers of the shelter, 2 cops. But don't remember, it's not only that, they had to get the bedding, they had to get food and water for the people. What about medications? All these different things. These people in the shelter are learning how to handle all these problems that are being thrown at them.
One of the big problems here is, well, there were several problems. One is weather forecasting wasn't as good then as it is now. The other thing is that very early in the flood, the Weather Service and the river forecasting bureaus lost their power and were absolutely no value for the rest of the storm. No criticism, they just couldn't do it. And nobody knew how bad it was going to get, and it came up gradual, and once it reached a tipping point, and we'll show a picture of the Williamsburg Firehouse, they posted a guard to stay awake in case it flooded, and he fell asleep, and somebody woke up an hour later and they had 2 feet of water in the firehouse. So a lot of these people that evacuate didn't have 16 hours or 24 hours or 5 days burning and the constant weather channel and the television. It happened, and they had to leave, and they had nothing. So it was a pretty sudden onset event.
There's the stockpile, what was left over in case they needed more, had to set up more points than for people to shelter. And of course, we set up a couple of pots for our people to get some sleep there because they were there for about a week. And of course, the National Guard was called out. And this is one of our police officers right here. He's giving directions to the National Guard to tell them how they can get to where they had been assigned at various places on the West Shore. So you can see there's a lot of cooperation here at this point in time. A lot of coordination is being developed throughout this thing. And also then Sheriff Fair, he got a hold of 72 different fire and auxiliary police officers from the western end of the county to also come down to the West Shore to help for security and also traffic control.
We're running short on time, so we do better.
Fine, I want to leave some time for Q&A.
Yeah, that was one place we had to park. We coordinated the helicopter across from the station. That's now a door building. There's a problem that Lee Wing had. The bottleneck, where he showed you the picture of the bottleneck, there it is. Back in Susquehanna River.
Now, another problem that comes up, and you look at most pictures of the kind of it, they cut the county in half. Anybody that had a medical emergency north of Harrisburg was cut off from Harrisburg. So what was done is they would load people on a boxcar in West Fairview, which was above water, haul them down to Stella Avenue in Williamsburg, and you could then go up Poplar Church and get over to Holy Spirit Hospital. So this was a workaround that was established to get critically ill people. I mean, there was a lot of workarounds like this, but all this was done spontaneously. Again, we've seen quite a few pictures, I think, of the aerial flooding.
Yeah, you saw that they had to evacuate 250 to 300 homes in Williamsburg. And those are streets down there. You see the water. There's the bridge. And you can see the debris from the other picture. You can see the debris pile up against it. And it withstood it. It made it through the ice jam, but made it through here. There's the Williamsburg Firehouse. And look at the stop sign. The stop sign's 6 feet tall. That gives you an idea how much water's there. There's looking at the other direction. And there's the marker still on the front of the firehouse where the guys woke up and felt the water there in the bunk room. And there's the Harvey Taylor Bridge. And we get down to New Cumberland. That was a steel bridge that you saw in one of the pictures on the Yellow Breeches Creek. And the river rescue was very busy because they evacuated 120 families in basically in the Bridge and Market Street areas, people who didn't get out quick enough. And there's a couple of pictures of New Cumberland. You saw the aerial shots. Here's the ground shots. There's the steel bridge, goes to Yellow Breeches Creek into Fairview Township. Look at the handy mark next to it. All you see is the bridge. There's Third Market. There's Julie's Cafe. We've got the sign to know that roof there, that's Julie's Cafe. Ned Kelly's. There's New Cumberland River Rescue. They're constantly touring to make sure there's not a problem.
The other workaround here is pretty neat. This is the New Cumberland Fire Department's fireboat. They had a boat, they put a portable pump on it and some hose, and they were prepared if they would have had a fire break out in the flooded area, that they would be able to go in and do some basic fire control. So we, yes, have had a fire boat in Cumberland County. Some of you can skip.
Yeah, we saw at Princeton Avenue here, at that particular community down there, about 100 houses. They had a floor drain that was hooked to the sanitation store. Is that water backed up from Route 581 down to 767. Look how deep that water was. The water came through the cinder block wall and up that store drain. And look how far that water was in these houses in that whole development. Not only there, but numerous places in the county. And so they ended up the washer, the dryer, the hot water heater, the gas furnace, the electrical panel, all of that was eventually replaced. And that happened all over a lot of part of the county.
And they were lucky. The people that were flooded by the river after the flood was, the water in the river was super saturated with mud, sewage, oil, all sorts of contamination and farm runoff, so that as the flood waters receded, they were left with inches and inches of mud. In this particular case, there's exposure to the sanitary sewer, because at that point it was common to hook up basement floor drains to the sanitary sewer. We can't do that anymore. But mostly, when we see the surface flooding, when they'll talk about those puddles, that water that comes into your house is generally pretty clear and mud-free. So, although they have a lot of damage, and it's not insured by your homeowners, it was better than having the flood mud to deal with after.
And this is a common sight throughout the county itself. And here's one of them down along the Cumberland Creek. You can see the debris that's out in front. And in that house, I don't know, back in the 1980s, that house caught fire. And it's still standing. They rebuilt the one piece that had to be rebuilt.
That's another thing with the legacy, we'll go through some of these pretty quick, is after the flood, for weeks, people were taking their debris out of their basements, and you'd go through Carlisle and all around the town and all around the area in Harrisburg, and piles and piles and piles of garbage that they came through with front loaders and dump trucks, and that was a tremendous problem. There was disease potential in that. We worked through it, and we were luckier than most locally in Carlisle because we didn't have the mud and all the oil and the other contamination to go with it.
Yep.
Okay, Carlisle, we pretty much talked about this. No major incidents for the sake of time.
You saw a bunch of those. There's the ground shot right there, the Williams Grove Mobile Home Park. This is interesting. Clayton Rock was lived in Camp Hill, and he was graphing it out as the rain was coming down, and it was in the paper. And when I got a call, initial call right here, we had over 4 inches of rain in Camp Hill. And then, but whenever the EOC call, we get over here on Thursday evening, and you can see now we're way up into this area how much rain had come down when they wanted to establish an EOC.
Carlisle had almost 4 inches of rain the Sunday before Agnes started and had flash flooding then, so the ground was already, as Noel showed in this one picture, we took Park, super saturated. And then we put this on top of it in Carlisle.
She said it rained all week.
Yeah.
Okay, so other problems, sewer plants flooded, washed away, homes swept away, a couple of solar walls collapsed, over a dozen in Hampton Township, depends on the soil type and where you're at. Bridges lost, bridges damaged.
In these 10, they had 3 bridges, they lost, and they basically cut half the township right down the middle. And the problem was, it fooled us the way it came in. He saw how he did that. And over 40 people lost their life, and over $2 billion worth of damage.
All right, so we'll wrap up here. 2 quick slides. I think we have, as I said, there was no prior planning existing. We were set up at that point for nuclear attack. All this is done on the fly. Back then, as we'll talk about, the community networks were much more resilient than they are now. There were a lot more volunteers and a lot more organizations. Everything that was done, when there were shelters that were set up, everybody had to figure out what was happening. Now you have to, if you're going to be a shelter manager, you have to go through training and all sorts of stuff. Radio communications, we had one radio frequency. The other thing that's significant to note is that Franklin County, Cumberland County, Perry County, Juniata County, Mifflin County were all on the same radio frequency. They all had the same frequency, and they had the same problems we did. So radio communications was virtually impossible. As we said, there were no major incidents, right? So
He makes it sound like we did.
Commissioner Sawyer says afterwards, he goes through and he lists a number of recommendations that what should be done if we're going to ever have this before. One was the liaison between the municipalities. Now, we were fortunate in a lot of cases, people knew each other. We knew, for example, the National Guard guy out here was Colonel Bricker, and we knew Chuck by name, so we could deal with Chuck, and Chuck could call the right people within his organization. You get into the shelters and set up, you'd call one preacher and he knew somebody else, and it went like that. It was all done on the fly. But Commissioner Sawyer is saying, let's do these things, and name it, instead of civil defense, we need a name change. We became emergency management after that, reporting procedures. And I think the next slide we touch on a little bit, what would happen today? Well, just to give you a couple of things, back then we had 37 fire companies in Cumberland County. Now we have, I think, 32, maybe, well, not even 32, we're down to 30. Carlisle, for example, had 5 fire stations. Each of those fire stations had somewhere between 25 and 40 active people. So we could muster several hundred people for the Agnes Flood. We're down to 2 fire stations with 20 active members. And if you're not an active member, you can't participate anymore in anything. So that, for example, somebody like us that has some knowledge and experience, if we have a disaster, we can't go into the firehouse and help because we're not trained and certified and we don't meet the current qualifications. We can't expand our organization anymore. It's 20 people, that's it. Down from 200. Back then, EMS, we had people you could call on. Now, with one exception, and that doesn't even exist anymore, all our EMS is paid, and it's hanging on by a thread. You're going to see EMS ambulance services go out of business because of the diesel fuel cost. We don't have the resiliency that we used to. There's no backup to call. Traffic control, we have fire police, Bob mentioned that 70-some, we probably have that many active fire police across the county now. They pretty much worn away. After this, we see the establishment of PEMA, the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, huge bureaucracies that bring in unlimited amounts of money and thousands of employees after something like this. We did it all on our own. It was all done on our own. We can't do that anymore. Increased demand for service. 1972, the firehouse I was at, we ran 100 calls. That station today does 1,200 calls. And back then, we just went to fires. Now, somebody overdoses, we go. Somebody has a cardiac, we go. I mean, we're all hazards. Somebody falls out of bed and won't let these back, we go. So, there's this high level of service expectations, coupled with the possibility, we now would not go pump a basement for a couple of reasons. One, we don't want the basement to collapse. 2 is we don't want DER to come after us because we pump somebody's pesticides into the aquifer. I mean, we'd probably be arrested for pumping a basement in today's climate, let alone litigation. But you couple all those changes with what we saw back then, and couple climate change on us, the 100-year flood now happens how often? So we're much more dependent on the government and bureaucracy than we were. I think, Bob, you would agree that this was something that we took care of locally. There was nobody for us to call. We couldn't do it. There was nobody on the horizon. The National Guard was our big backup. If anything got really serious back in the 70s, the National Guard came, and they protected us from the end of the world. And they did. They did tremendous service in this whole thing. So, is that it? Wrap this up? Okay. Let me just start reference.